Thank you so much for being here. My name is Will Gravitt. I work in the advancement office here at Ashland Theological Seminary. We're so happy that you're here. This has become something of a tradition here at Ashland Seminary. During the week where trustees are visiting the university and seminary, through the gracious contribution of Dr. Byron's education and knowledge, we were able to celebrate some of the best of what the seminary does, which is to advise and shape the thoughts and culture of faith. And so we're excited that you're here this evening. There's just a couple of housekeeping things. One, after the presentation this evening, there'll be a light reception out front, so you can help us eat cookies and drink some punch. We'd appreciate that. And also, there's a little beige card, and if you haven't filled that out yet, please do that and pass it this way. Angie's at the other end here with a basket to gather those. She's going to do a drawing throughout the presentation. And so if you've already filled it out, please do that. If you haven't, fill it out and pass it down that way. We're here for just an hour and a half or so to spend time together and learn, and Dr. Byron will certainly maximize that time. So I'm just going to introduce him right after I say a word of prayer, and then he will take it on from there. So let's pray together.
Father, thank you for the opportunity to gather. We appreciate the grace that you have bestowed upon us that gives us the opportunity to share our lives in faith. We pray that you will bless our time, encourage our hearts, and challenge our minds. In Christ's name, amen. Dr. Byron had, like I said, he's this has kind of become an institution around here. We get to celebrate. We always have a great crowd and terrible weather. So the combination somehow works, and we're happy that you made it out and joined us this evening. Dr. Byron is a professor of New Testament here at the seminary, and beyond that, he is just a key member of our community. He's an encourager of students. He's a challenger of faculty and friends, and always pushes us to sort of be our very best. He serves on the cabinet and leadership of the seminary, and plays some roles of leadership even at the university level. Not only that, he's also a wonderful community member. He serves as the president of the board of the symphony here in town, and his interests are wide and varied. And maybe he'll touch on some of that, I don't know. But along with he and his wife, Lori, they are wonderful members of our community, and we're pleased to have him here sharing tonight.
Thank you. Well, there's one way to fill a house, and that's do a lecture on Revelation. Can everybody hear me okay, or should I move this up a little better? Is that better? Okay. First of all, thank you for coming. As Will said, this is sort of somehow evolved into a bit of an institution. I was counting up. This is the 7th one in a row now that I've done. I do them because I really enjoy connecting with people from the community. It's kind of just by default become the same week that trustees are here. So no offense to y'all folks, but I didn't do this for you, but I'm more than happy to have you here. But it's important to me to bring good biblical scholarship to people who are not part of the seminary, and that's why we do this. So I want to start off, first of all, by just acknowledging the people. I need to say thank you to Dr. John Schultz for indulging me to do this for 7 years in a row now. So thank you, John. Dr. Crothers, for allowing the trustees to come instead of working them somewhere else. All right, and your wife, Rilla. And, of course, I need to acknowledge my wife, Lori, who's in the front. We will be celebrating our 25th wedding anniversary in May. You can decide who's gone through a tribulation more than the others. As I said, we've been doing this now for 7 years, and I was trying to think every year. I try to come up with a topic that I think is going to be relevant to what's going on at the time. Last year I did a thing on the historical Jesus. Before that it was on archaeology and the fakes and the forgeries. And as I was trying to think about what to do, just some things began creeping up in the news about Revelation, and it seems like Revelation is something that is always current. There's always something going on with it out there. So I thought that would be a good thing to do this year. And considering that we've been doing this for a while, I kind of thought to myself, I said, I think we're ready for this one. Okay? I think we're ready. Just to give you a little bit of orientation tonight as we get started, on the screen what I have here tonight is a map of what we know in the first century world as Asia Minor. You will now know it as Western modern-day Turkey. I brought two representatives from Turkey tonight to join me. All right, Darius and Emily, who are missionaries to Turkey, who are students here. Well, Emily graduated, Darius got left back. But so there's a few places on there that they recognize. And I wanted to use a map tonight because we're going to be dealing particularly with the historical and the social world of the book of Revelation. So. When we often think about Revelation, what I notice is that people tend to approach the book from one of two extremes. Revelation is really a very odd book. I mean, you open it up and you've got angels flying around, pouring out bowls of wrath, dragons, multi-headed beasts running around, and it's hard sometimes to know if you're actually reading a book in the Bible or something out of Harry Potter. All right? And so as we're going through the book of Revelation at times, what I notice is that there's two extremes. On the one hand, I notice some people end up taking what I would say an unhealthy preoccupation with it. Everything is read through the book of Revelation. Their whole life is about Revelation. They'll sit in front of CNN with their Bible trying to map out what's going to be happening next and if they can predict it. On the other hand, because Revelation is such a bizarre and unusual book, some people find it easier just to plain outright ignore it. And I understand that as well. Tonight, however, what I would like to do is sort of just give you a different perspective on the book of Revelation. I'm willing to bet that many, if not most of you, have never heard this type of an approach before. I will tell you before we get into it that this is a standard approach in biblical studies. Hello, Jim. Good to see you. So what I'm telling you tonight is not something I'm making up. What I am, though, presenting to you, though, is a standard approach. And I would like for it to at least be presented to you so that it's actually out there to the people that go to the churches and live their life day in and day out outside of the halls of a place like this. When we think of Revelation, inevitably, the topic of the end of the world comes up. This seems to be where people's focus tends to go first. I remember in 1988, coming out of the Darien Lakes Amusement Park, you know where that is, don't you? And finding on the windshield of my car a pamphlet with 88 reasons why Jesus was coming back in 1988. I don't think he came back. If he did, we're all in trouble. September came and went, and, well, Jesus didn't return. And the gentleman who had put together the pamphlet admitted his mistake. And his mistake was that when he was doing the arithmetic, it had something to do with so many days in Daniel's and Jewish feasts and whatnot. He had made a mathematical error, so he reprinted his pamphlet with 89 reasons why Jesus was coming back in 1989. If you don't go the first time, try again, right? About 4 years ago, if you were driving between Akron and Pittsburgh, you might have seen this on the side of Route 76. Anybody remember this? This was a billboard put up by a radio ministry. Its founder had become convinced that he had determined the exact day when the end of the world was going to begin, when Jesus was going to return. He had concluded that it was going to happen on May 21st, 2011. They did an awful lot of advertising on the radio, billboards across the country, and a bunch of other media blasts. I remember I was called up and interviewed by the Akron Beacon. The reporter wanted to know what I thought about it, and I said, I don't buy it. And she was really disappointed. She was looking for something juicier. And I was like, we simply approach this from two different directions. I mean, this gentleman and I will not line up probably at all. May 21st came and went, and Jesus did not return. For the record, I spent May 21st, 2011 at the birthday party of a 2-year-old in Pittsburgh. I wasn't afraid that Jesus was going to be returning that day, although I'll admit I may have kind of glanced up to the sky now and then just to make sure, okay? I mean, you have to hedge your bets, right? Okay. This year, we're going to be experiencing a phenomenon. We're going to have 4 lunar eclipses within a 2-year period. And the first one happened in April of last year. The second one happened in September. The third one will happen again this April, and then the fourth one will happen in September. This lunar eclipse, because of the way they work and the way the reflection of the sun, is going to give the moon a rather reddish look, which would then, of course, make it look like blood, at least in some people's mind. And so some people have suggested that this is a fulfillment of Joel chapter 2, verse 31, and Revelation 6, verse 12, where it is to say that the moon looks like blood. Also last year, we witnessed the scourge of the Ebola virus. Going across Africa, killing tens of thousands of people, and for the very first time, as far as we know, actually jumping continents into Europe and to North America and killing people there. In fact, even here in Ohio, we had our own close call when somebody that was infected visited right here in right there in Akron area. And people saw this as, once again, as they're looking at Revelation and other books, they're saying, here we have proof. The plagues are beginning to happen. Also this last year, if there was ever evidence that the end of the world might be at hand, it was Nicolas Cage's attempt to reboot his flagging career with the Left Behind series. This series of books and movies, fictionally constructed somewhat rather loosely on the book of Revelation and some other imaginative ideas, was redone this year with Nicolas Cage as the star power that was going to bring in the people to the theaters. Interestingly enough, some friends of ours that we knew in college went to go see the movie, and they posted on Facebook, "We're watching Left Behind, and we think we've been left behind. We're the only 2 people in the theater." But probably what you're not familiar with is the more, I would say, the more aspects of conspiracy that are going on to bring about the end of the world. The energy drink Monster. This is a drink that is popular among teenagers and 20-year-olds who not only think they can live forever, but can do it without sleeping. Because it's loaded up with sugar, caffeine, and some other type of chemicals that is supposed to keep them going and going and going. But what you don't know, actually, that what you're looking at on that can is what looks like the letter M in the neon green. I'm assuming that this is where the monster has scratched 3 claws down to give us the M. You're not actually looking at the letter M. What you're looking at here is a secret code that reveals the number 666. And the reason for this is because somebody looked at this and noticed that those 3 lines each look like a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. They look like the Hebrew letter Vav, which by coincidence is the 6th letter in the alphabet. Therefore, what you have on the side of the Monster can is 666. Further compounding their theory is the fact that the tagline on the side of the can is "Unleash the Beast." Both the beast arises in Revelation chapter 13, and it's in Revelation 13:18 that we encounter the number 666. These are the kinds of things that are always cropping up in relation to the book of Revelation when people think about it, the things that people are looking for. And as I said, there tends to be a preoccupation with the symbolic, with the unusual aspects of Revelation. Tonight, I don't want to spend as much time on those aspects. Don't worry, we will cover them. But I want to introduce you not only to a different perspective, but more importantly, I want to introduce to you what was the setting that was going on that led John to write this document to begin with. Okay? I want you to actually see, why would John write this? And so, just to lay some ground rules, let me just let you know what we won't do and what we will do. I have no intentions of trying to challenge or undo what others have said. If you have a favorite preacher or teacher or a book on the topic, I will not be mentioning it tonight. I just simply don't have the time. There is so much that is printed and written in relation to the book of Revelation each year, it would be virtually impossible for me to do that. What's more, I can't possibly cover every aspect, every little jot and tittle of the book of Revelation. Again, there simply isn't time. This is a very rich document, a very important book of the Bible. And I teach this book in my New Testament introduction class. I get 3 hours to do it, and even then, I know I can't do it justice. Don't answer that question. So to actually be able to do all of that tonight just won't happen. So I guarantee that most, if not all of you, will leave with some level of disappointment tonight because, oh, but he didn't talk about this, or oh, he didn't say that. I will promise you, however, that before the evening is done, I will provide you an identification of who the beast is and the meaning of the number 666. That's how I keep you here the rest of the night. What I do want to do, however, is start off, first of all, by talking about what Revelation is. Because we approach this document so often with a set of presuppositions about what we think the book of Revelation is, and we read them at times into it, and I think we're missing important things that the book wants to teach us. Secondly, I want us to actually explore what was the social and historical setting. As I said, why did John write this book? What did the first readers of this book think when they read it? When I started off the evening, we had the map on the screen of Asia Minor with 7 churches. John wrote this book to 7 real churches that lived at a real time in history at a particular geographic location. It meant something to them in their day. And I'm a firm believer that before we can actually apply the book to our own lives and say, what does it mean to us in the 21st century, we must understand what it would have meant to the people who first read it. Because contrary to popular belief, when John was penning this book, he was not thinking about an audience in Ashland, Ohio in the 21st century. He was thinking about 7 churches in Asia Minor and the things that he thought he had to say to them. With that, then, let's move to what Revelation is. Revelation is 3 things tonight. Well, not just tonight, always, but tonight. First of all, Revelation is an apocalypse. The word apocalypse comes from the Greek word. I want you all to listen carefully, right? Because I'm going to teach you Greek. Comes from the Greek word apocalypse. Should we try it all together? Ready? All together. Ready? Apocalypse. Ready? Apocalypse. Wonderful. You've all just learned a Greek word tonight. We'll be collecting tuition on the way out the door, okay? The word apocalypse simply means to uncover, to reveal, which is why we call the book of Revelation, Revelation. Okay? That is what it actually means. The problem, however, is that in the 20th and 21st century, we've actually equated it with this cataclysmic event. Something that's going to either be the beginning of the end of the world or is the end of the world. But in its actual original meaning, it just simply means to unveil or to reveal. Part of the way that this misunderstanding of the word has been perpetuated is through popular media. Francis Ford Coppola's film Apocalypse Now is a classic example. Coppola's interpretation of the Vietnam War was for him a symbol that the war represented of an event that was happening that was signaling the demise of civilization as we knew it. More recently, we see things like the preoccupation with the so-called zombie apocalypse. that a virus is going to come into the world and a certain segment of humanity is going to be infected, and then they're going to go around biting other people, infecting them, and then the whole world is eventually going to be destroyed. Even more recently, as of Monday, as the so-called historic snowstorm was heading towards the tri-state area of New York, Connecticut, and New England, I heard weather forecasters referring to as Snowpocalypse 2015. Which immediately raises the question, if an apocalypse, at least in your thinking, is a one-time event, how can you attach a year to it? As opposed to Snowpocalypse 2013. But in antiquity, apocalypse was not actually understood as an end-time event. Actually, apocalypse, using its correct word, was actually a common form of Jewish and Greek literature, Christian literature. When you are reading the Bible and you see Revelation, I can understand why you would sort of like almost get a whiplash when you read this book after moving from some of the other books in the New Testament. But the fact is that in the first century, this is not an unusual type of book. We have many examples that actually look and read just like Revelation. It is a type of literature. In the Jewish side, we've got, for instance, the book of Enoch, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and elsewhere. In what is known as the Apocrypha, and in some Bibles, we have 4th Ezra. In Christian circles, we have the Apocalypse of Paul, the Apocalypse of Peter. There's also the Apocalypse of Moses and Adam. It seemed like it became a popular thing. Everybody wanted one. I'm kidding. It's a joke. Laugh. So the first thing we need to keep in mind when we approach Revelation is that it is first and foremost, this is the type of literature from those days. This contains certain elements that people expected. At the same time, when we talk about it as an apocalypse, I think we should take the testimony of Revelation seriously. And in chapter 1, verse 1, the very first opening words is that this is a revelation of Jesus Christ. Which tells us two things. One, that this is a message from Jesus. That is, Jesus is revealing something to those 7 churches. At the same time, as we're going to see tonight, John is going to be revealing Jesus Christ to those churches. Because in John's opinion, these people have either forgotten who Jesus was or never knew him the way that they thought they did. The second thing Revelation is a prophecy. 5 times it uses this word to describe itself. The problem with the word prophecy, however, is exactly the same problem we have with the word apocalypse. When we hear the word prophecy, we automatically run to this idea of predicting the future. We bring in this sort of crystal ball perspective on it. But the fact is if you actually look at the way prophecy is used in the biblical literature, go back to the Old Testament where most of that prophetic literature is, it actually has a lot less to do with predicting the future and more with the messenger of God bringing a message to God's people. Think about Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, where the prophet comes and what he is saying to those people is, this is what God says, listen up, straighten up. And if there is a prediction about the future, it's usually not something that's going to happen in the distant future, but the very near future. If you don't listen, you're going to see the Assyrians or the Babylonians. They're going to come in and they're going to lead you away. And in this context then of how we understand biblical prophecy, that means that when we read Revelation, we need to keep in mind that although there are certainly predictive elements in Revelation, first and foremost, the book of Revelation is a message to God's people. Thirdly, it's a letter. Now, most people don't think about it in that way. But the fact of the matter is that Revelation is a letter. It begins and ends like many of the letters that we have in the New Testament. Revelation chapter 1, verse 4, John, to the 7 churches in Asia, grace and peace to you from him who was, who is, and who is to come. And then it closes out there at the end of chapter 22, verse 21. The grace of the Lord Jesus be with all of the saints. This sounds just like what we expect at the beginning and the end of the Apostle Paul's letters. And so, no matter all of the symbolic imagery that we have and dragons and angels flying around, we need to keep in mind that this book begins and ends as an epistle. What's more, in the middle of it, we also have 7 mini letters written to 7 churches. And the fact that they are contained within the overall larger letter means that John intends for them each to read it all together. In other words, whatever applies to the church in Ephesus can also apply to the church in Thyatira or Smyrna, as well as the whole book. It is a letter. And so with that in mind, we need to keep in mind tonight that Revelation is a letter to 7 first-century churches. All right? And it's a prophetic message for them. John was writing to 7 real churches. They were there. They had issues in their day, and John is addressing them here. So now, the setting of Revelation. Why even write this, and what was going on? One thing you need to appreciate about the time period in which Revelation is written, indeed, in the time period that Christianity is birthed and begins to grow, is this is a period of time known as the Pax Romana, otherwise known as the Peace of Rome. This time period, as it's known by historians, usually begins with the beginning of the reign of Caesar Augustus when he comes to power, and it ends somewhere around the end of the 2nd century with the death of Marcus Aurelius of gladiator fame. Okay? He's the dude in the beginning of the movie, all right? And this is a very important time because during this period of Roman history, for the most part, civil wars between the various Roman parties cease to exist. Major wars are no longer happening. What's more, the infrastructure of the Roman Empire is actually being laid. Some of you I know are looking at me and go, what does this have to do with Revelation tonight? Hang on. But during this time period, roads are beginning to be developed, and it's safe to actually travel. The sea lanes in the Mediterranean are cleared of pirates. Trade and travel is now possible without being accosted. And it's often been noted by New Testament scholars and historians alike that because of this time period, Christianity was able to spread and grow so quickly because of the circumstances that allowed it to happen. Now, this wasn't a completely peaceful time, because smack dab in the middle of this so-called Peace of Rome, the Jewish rebellion happens against Rome, and eventually the Romans move into Judea. They destroy Jerusalem, and they destroy the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. Not exactly a good piece of PR for your so-called Peace of Rome, which is why I tell my students this is really not the Peace of Rome, but it's more the peace enforced by Rome. I mean, think about the opening scene of Gladiator. This is supposed to be the time of the Pax Romana, and it's a brutal battle scene. Rome enforced its peace, and it took peace the way it wanted it, where it wanted it. But there's also another aspect of this story that's important tonight, and that is this. The idea of the Pax Romana became the official public story of the Roman Empire. This is what Rome claimed it did for everybody that it had subjected. We brought you peace. We brought you safe roads. We brought you clear sea lanes. We brought you prosperity and good economics. This is the official story that Rome puts out. And we find it in such things, for instance, in some of the writings of their historians. On the screen was a historian who wrote sometime around 30 AD. He's declaring how on the day that the empire was founded, people ran around raising their arms, saying, oh, thank God, the empire is here. For now, we're actually going to have, our marriages are going to have sanctity, our children to be protected, my property is going to be safe, security and peace is in place, all because of Rome. And these are the official lines, the official story that Rome is perpetuating. But it wasn't just in their historical and official documents. They did it in other ways. On the screen is a coin, and on the back of that coin is a woman that is the goddess Roma. Roma was the female personification of the city of Rome, and by extension, the Roman Empire. When you thought of Rome, you thought of her. What's more, this was a goddess that was worshipped throughout the Roman Empire. There were temples to her. In fact, many of these coins also have on the front side, also have one of the emperors, declaring that the emperor and the goddess Roma are one. As you look at the coin, what you see here is Roma is actually sitting on the breastplate of her suit of armor, symbolic that this is a time of peace, so we no longer need to wear our armor. In her outstretched hand is the god of victory, Nike. Yes, the same one from the sneakers, folks. And this is symbolic of the fact that Rome has grasped victory in its hand. Not only did you encounter Roman propaganda that it brought peace to the world in the official history, not only was it there in the temples in the way that you worshiped Roma, it was on the very currency that you were paid. That which you bought your bread and your wine and your oil with. Everywhere you looked, the official story of Rome was there. We brought you peace. Compounding this story is the role that the emperors played during this time period. This coin is from 17 BC. On the front is Caesar Augustus, emperor, when Jesus was born. On the back, what looks like a starburst is symbolic of a comet. When Julius Caesar died, it was said that a comet appeared in the sky, and they took this as a sign that he was now a god. And then in the back of that coin, we have a Latin inscription, the divine Julius. Julius Caesar is a god. Even more important for Caesar Augustus, before Julius Caesar died, he became the adopted son of Julius. So Julius now could claim with all pride that he was the son of a god. By the time we get to the end of the first century, when the book of Revelation is being written and the Emperor Domitian is in power, Domitian now is claiming that he is a god. On the front we have here Domitian, and on the back, look at this, the divine Caesar, Emperor Domitian, sitting on top of the world. This is the world in which Christianity was born and was living in the first century. A world where the Roman Empire claimed that it brought peace and that its emperors were divine. One thing we don't often appreciate, however, about Christianity during this period is that for the first 30 years or so, Christianity was actually not seen as a separate religion from Judaism. Most of the early converts from Christianity were themselves Jewish, which means that as Jews living in the Roman Empire, they received both the advantages and the disadvantages of being Jewish. One disadvantage, in 49 AD, we know that the Emperor Claudius expelled all Jews from Rome. When he did that, also those that were Jewish followers of Jesus were also expelled. So in Acts chapter 18, the Apostle Paul meets Priscilla and Aquila, two people that are already Christians who have just been expelled from Rome. As Jews, Claudius did not actually center, all right, who believes in Jesus, who doesn't, you can stay, you can go. All Jews left. At the same time, related to some of the earlier slides, Jews had one advantage in the area of worship. And it's like this. In the Roman Empire, you could worship any god you wanted. Anyone. As long as you also worshiped the emperor. Jews negotiated themselves an exemption. Rather than having to offer a sacrifice to the emperor, they negotiated an agreement whereby they would actually offer a sacrifice in the temple to Yahweh on behalf of the emperor, not to the emperor. And I can almost imagine the priest going in there, and, oh Lord, we bring you this offering for your servant, the emperor. Give him long life. Make his reign be long. So followers of Jesus, for quite a long time, enjoyed the advantages and disadvantages of being Jewish. In 64 AD, however, this begins to change. In 64, a terrible fire spreads throughout Rome and burns somewhere between 25 and 33% of the city. We don't know exactly how it happened, but there's been an awful lot of blame over the years, even from early Roman historians accusing Nero of lighting the fire. Whether he actually started the fire or not, we don't know, but his actions surrounding that fire were certainly suspicious. He delayed coming back to the city. He happened to conveniently not be there when it started. He delayed coming back to the city, and then once he did get back to the city and the fire was put out, rather than actually reconstructing the city for the homes that people had lost, which incidentally was one of the poorest sections of Rome, he began building himself a new palace there that he was going to make so large it was called Colossus. It's where the Colosseum is today. That, folk, is where the name Colosseum came from. Somebody else put that there instead of Nero's palace. This, of course, then just stokes the suspicion that Nero had something to do with the fire. Nero then needs to deflect suspicion, and he needs a scapegoat. And for the first time in the history of Christianity, Nero now begins a deliberate persecution of Christians in Rome. He rounds up Christians that are living in the city of Rome, and as we're told from Roman historians as well as later Christian historians, they're gathered up. Some are thrown to the arenas where they're mauled and devoured by wild beasts, and some are taken to his garden, tied up on stakes where they're lit with fire to supposedly light his garden parties. And for the first time, Christians now are being singled out from their fellow Jewish, from the people that are Jewish. Now, the fact is, yes, Nero did a really bad thing to Christians, persecuting them. But Nero was actually an equal opportunity abuser. The fact is, in the end, nobody liked Nero. He went around killing lots of people. In fact, he ended up making his own throne unstable because he killed off everybody in his own family, including his own mother, who, by the way, was the one who used all her political skill to get him to be emperor to begin with. In the end, things became so bad, his administration was so corrupt, the empire was going to become bankrupt. The Senate decided that we had enough of this, we're going to declare him enemy of the state, and they sent the Roman soldiers to go arrest him. He was not in Rome, he was outside of Rome in a villa. Nero, recognizing that the end was near and the soldiers were coming, with the assistance of a servant, committed suicide. End of story. Or was it? Now I could do Discovery Channel, couldn't I? The situation surrounding Nero's death left some people doubting that he was actually really dead. All sorts of rumors were spreading throughout Rome that Nero had not died, but actually had escaped over the river Euphrates into Parthia or Persia, what is now modern-day Iran, and that he was going to gather up an army and come back one day and have his revenge on his enemies. We know this from a number of sources in antiquity. One of them comes from a Roman historian, Suetonius, who not only tells us about this, but talks about an incident when somebody showed up while he was a teenager claiming to be Nero. Nero met his death in the 32nd year of his age, on the anniversary of the murder of Octavia. Such was the public rejoicing that people put on liberty caps and ran all over the city. Yet there were some who for a long time decorated his tomb with spring flowers and then produced his statues in the fringed toga as if he were still alive and would shortly return and deal destruction to his enemies. And then down at the bottom of the last paragraph, in fact, 20 years later, when I was a young man, a person of unknown origin appeared who claimed that he was Nero. We know of at least 3 impostors who showed up over the years claiming to be Nero. But this is not just a preoccupation with, by the Romans. This also shows up in Jewish and Christian documents. In a document known as the Sibylline Oracles from roughly the same time period, we have these statements about Nero. And this is going to sound a little bit like the book of Revelation, folks. From Sebastinus, Augustus, this is their name for the Romans, Beliar, an evil figure who's often referred to as the devil, shall come, and he will raise up the hills, the great fiery sun and the bright moon, and the sea will stand still. He will raise the dead and work many signs before men through deceit, and many mortals shall be led astray, both Hebrews and lawless men. Sound a little bit like Revelation, apocalyptic language. An evil storm of war will come upon Jerusalem from Italy, and it will sack the great temple of God. Nero is the one who sent the armies to Jerusalem that eventually destroyed that temple. And then a great king will from Italy, like a runaway slave, slip unseen and unheard over the Euphrates River, one who is guilty of matricide. Nero killed his mother. This was a very popular rumor, and I only learned this week in preparation for this lecture that this rumor lasted for hundreds of years in Augustine's City of God. He talks about how there were people in his day who still thought that Nero was alive, actually the same age that he was when he disappeared, and that they would actually come back. He would come back. This was a long-standing rumor, folks. And so what we discover then is that Nero really is the Elvis of the ancient world. It's amazing what you can find on Google. It really is. This idea that Nero had not died and might come back really does permeate the fears of many people, and on the one hand, the hopes of others. One last thing to talk about the setting before we actually dive into the book of Revelation tonight, and that is I want to talk just a little bit more about the emperor worship. Emperor worship, as I said, was becoming a growing practice in the first century. When Caesar Augustus died in 14 AD, the Senate declared that he was a god. I want you to just think about this for a moment. Jesus is a teenager living in Galilee, worshiping the Lord in the temple, and there is somebody out there that the world is claiming is God, other than Yahweh. And remember, the Romans are running the country. We know also that Pilate erected a temple or some type of shrine to the Emperor Tiberius where he could be worshipped. What you're looking at on the screen is the only inscriptional evidence we have for the Pontius Pilate. Whoever's lovely finger that is actually pointing to it. But above there, also in Latin, is the word Tiberium. Spain also attempted to erect a temple to Tiberius. But probably the most crucial event in this time period related to emperor worship was the attempt by Caligula to have his own statue installed in the Jerusalem temple. You see, Caligula looked around and he saw that all of his ancestors were being worshipped as God, and he said, well, why in the world should I wait till I'm dead? If being God is such a good gig, I want it now. And so he begins ordering that his statues be erected throughout the empire, including in the Jerusalem temple. The Jews, of course, refuse, they resist. Even the Roman governors in Judea recognize that this was not the smartest move. Caligula, however, insists he wants the statue put in the temple by force. Miraculously, the whole situation just disappears when Caligula has one of those mysterious knife hole heart attacks that are so deadly to emperors in those days. (40 AD). This is the time period of the book of Acts. The church is meeting to pray daily in the temple. This would have impacted them somehow. At the same time, the emperors are more and more taking the name Lord, Savior, Son of God. If you are a follower of Jesus, and these are the titles that you use to refer to Him, think about what's going on in your mind and the competition that's going on. There is somebody else who says, no, I am your Lord, I am your Savior. By the time we get to the end of the first century, when the book of Revelation is being written, Domitian, like Caligula, is demanding that he be worshipped as a god, and we have coins from him where he's sitting on the throne of Zeus declaring, I am the Father of gods. Within 10 years after the book of Revelation is written, another emperor will come to the throne named Trajan. Trajan also will demand that he be worshipped as a god, so much so that those who do not worship him will then be persecuted. Pliny, the governor of Bithynia, not far from where the 7 churches are, writes an account to the Emperor Trajan of how he interrogated those who were Christians and would not worship him. He says this, This is the method I have followed with those who were brought before me as Christians. I asked them directly if they were Christians. The ones who answered affirmatively, I questioned again with a warning. Yet a third time, those who persisted, I ordered led away. Read here, they were killed. Those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, when they swore before me, look at this, called on the gods and offered incense and wine to your image, and also cursed Christ, I thought worthy to be acquitted. Others, named by an informer, said they had been Christians, but they had given it up. These also worshipped both your image and the images of gods and cursed Christ. By the time we get to the end of the first century, Christianity and what it believed about the person of Jesus and what was going on in the Roman Empire was on a direct collision course with one another. And within 10 years after John writes Revelation, things like we see described by Pliny begin to happen. Now we can look at Revelation. And I want to do that tonight by looking first at the 7 letters, and then we'll dive in and take a brief look at the symbolism. John writes 7 letters to the churches. The first one is the church at Ephesus, located on the coast of the Aegean. It is a harbor city. Well, actually, it used to be. Ephesus is now located 30 miles inland. Gee, did they move it? No, the harbor kept silting up. So now if you take a cruise to Ephesus, you got to get a bus to go see what was once a harbor town. But during John's day, Ephesus was the capital of Asia. It was the most prominent city in the area. Okay? And in fact, in addition to all of the other temples that were there, we have the temple to Nike. You walk down the street of Ephesus, you can see a statue of Nike. You can see Asclepius, the god of healing. But you can also see numerous temples where the emperors were being worshipped. This was what confronted believers in Ephesus day in and day out as they went to buy their bread, their wine, or go to their jobs. This is what they had to confront. And when Jesus, through the pen of John, talks to this church, he praises them first of all. He says, you don't tolerate evildoers. And he says, when false apostles come among you, you test them. And then he says something that's rather cryptic, you hate the work of the Nicolaitans. Now, he doesn't tell us who they are or what they do, and we'll actually touch on that in a few minutes. But John actually praises them for attempting to stay faithful. But look at the last thing that he says to them. I have this against you. You have abandoned your first love. A city that was one of the most prominent cities in early Christianity. The Apostle Paul visited here many times, spent several years here. We have a letter to this city, and now Jesus says to them, you have abandoned your first love. Quite an indictment. If you visited Ephesus, you would have seen what was being built, or maybe even completed by the time John wrote the book of Revelation, a new temple to the emperor. This one was to the Emperor Domitian. There on the screen is the Emperor Domitian, and I'm standing next. I'm the one on the right, in case you can't figure it out. The reason I have me up there tonight is not so you can look at my rather dynamic physique, but I want you to look at the size of the head and the forearm, and then imagine the building that must have contained this statue. This is the emperor when John is writing. He is demanding to be worshipped, and this is the newest addition to the city of Ephesus. Moving up the coast to the northeast about 35 miles is the city of Smyrna, also a harbor town. Smyrna doesn't receive any criticism, actually. They seem to be a good group of people. We know that it was a wealthy city. Often in its inscription, it boasts not only of its wealth, but of its beauty and of its size. John talks there of how the Christians are being slandered by those of the synagogue of Satan. We don't really think there was a synagogue here dedicated to Satan, folks. Actually, this is John talking about how those in the Jewish community seem to be in opposition to their, shall we say, their cousins in the Christian community. So there's some kind of pressure going on here from the local Jewish population. And John says to them, should I say Jesus says to them through the pen of John, you're going to be arrested and tested for 10 days. And this is an allusion to Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. And one thing you're going to notice tonight, if you read Revelation in general, John is constantly reaching back into the Old Testament and bringing forth imagery, people, and events, and applying them in new and different ways to the situation of the 7 churches. And in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, we have the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have been brought into Nebuchadnezzar's court. They're going to be raised up to be Babylonian princes. And part of that process includes eating the food that belongs to the king. And Daniel goes to the man in charge of the food and he says, if we eat this food, will we become impure? Probably because, as it was quite normal, the food that the king was eating had been sacrificed and offered to the Babylonian gods. The head chef says, sorry, Daniel can't do that. The king will have my head. Daniel says, do me this. Test us for 10 days. And we will eat vegetables and water. And at the end of that 10 days, they're said to be in better condition than anybody else. It seems from what we know about Smyrna, as well as what John is doing here and drawing on the story of Daniel, that the Christians in Smyrna are probably under pressure by the local population to be good citizens, to participate not only in the pagan worship, but also to worship the emperor. Another 40 miles up the road is the city of Pergamum. And I have no idea what's flying on my screen. That's not part of the presentation. Pergamum, 40 miles up the road, was actually the capital of Asia before Ephesus. In fact, these two cities were in competition. It was like LA and New York, you know. And in fact, before Ephesus became prominent, it was the capital, and it also had built the first temple to the emperor in 29 BC. Okay? And John has some very unusual things that he says to the people here. Listen to this. This is the message to the church at Pergamum. I know where you are living, where Satan's throne is. You are holding fast to my name, and you did not deny your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you, where Satan lives. But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, and who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the people of Israel, so that they would eat meat sacrificed to idols and practice fornication. So you also have some who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. So, your church is located where Satan lives. Not exactly something you're going to put on the brochure. Okay? Apparently, the Christians in Pergamum had had a difficult time, perhaps even in the recent past. Somebody named Antipas had been martyred. And John praises them for remaining faithful, but he's a little upset with them because they're listening to the teachings of Balaam and the Nicolaitans. Now, Balaam, you may remember from your Sunday school lessons, is the dude with the talking donkey. All right? Everybody knows that. You come home and you heard about Balaam's talking donkey. That's not the portion of the story, though, that John has in mind here. Because once Balaam straightens out his talking beast, he continues the rest of the journey he was on. He was on his way to Balak, who had hired him. Because Balak had noticed the children of Israel passing from Egypt into the promised land, and he didn't like it. So he says to Balaam, come and curse these people. The problem is every time Balaam opens his mouth, he only blesses them. So Balaam says to Balak this. How'd you like that one? Balaam says to Balak. Okay? He says, if you really want to see them undone, get them to marry foreign women. Because when they do that, they will begin to worship the gods of their wives. And that's exactly what happens in the book of Numbers. And by drawing on the story of Balaam, talking about meat sacrificed to idols, and then at the same time talking about the teachings of the Nicolaitans, we can see what John is talking about here. There seems to be a group of people in Pergamum, probably people going by, or at least known as the Nicolaitans, who are Christians. But they say it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols because we all know that they're not really gods anyway. This is the same exact attitude the Apostle Paul runs into in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. We can eat this meat because it doesn't matter. And John says, no, you cannot do that. I hold this against you. If you were to go to Pergamum today or even antiquity, you would see springing up from the middle of the city this hill, this mountain that I've actually zoomed in on quite a bit. This is the Acropolis. This is the high point of the city. This is actually their theater. It sits like this. Okay, and you go down, and then down below here is the stage. And up here were a variety of temples to a number of gods, and there were also a number of temples to the emperors. And sitting on top of this Acropolis, if you looked up during the time of John, you would see this. This is the altar of Zeus. What does it look like? Huh? I'm not quite ready to go there. Does it look like a chair, a throne? Yeah. This is what we believe John is referring to when he talks about, I know where you live, where Satan's throne is. This is the place where the Christians in Pergamum live. This is what they deal with day in and day out. Thyatira. Thyatira is a wealthy city. It's also the home of many trade guilds related to textiles. We know, for instance, that Lydia in the book of Acts, chapter 16, Paul meets her in Philippi, but she comes from here. Also the home of trade guilds. Now, their trade guilds or their trade unions weren't quite the same as ours today. Okay, you didn't get together to get higher wages. They may have done that, but it was sort of like a club where you got together and you benefited from one another. And if you wanted to get work, then you were a part of a group of textile makers or dyers. It's maybe how you got your supplies. It's maybe how you got your customers. But at the same time, trade guilds in those days had a patron deity. You know, like some days, some occupations can have a patron saint. You'd have a patron deity, a god or a goddess that you would all gather together to honor and to worship. And it was common to have your meetings in the temple of the god or goddess, where it was expected that you would participate in worship and also eat anything that had been presented in the matter of sacrifice. If you are a Christian, however, living in Thyatira, and you want to make sure that you can be able to get the dye that you need to make whatever kind of wool you're making, you're going to now have to make a decision. Because if I don't go to the temple, people are going to know I'm not there. Therefore, I may not get the business I need. And John is writing to this church, and he says to them this. He says, I know your works, your love, faith, service, patient endurance. I know that your last works are greater than the first. But I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet, and is teaching and beguiling my servants to practice fornication, listen again, to eat meat sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her immorality. Once again, John reaches back and grabs from the Old Testament a figure. Jezebel, you may remember, was married to King Ahab of Israel, but she was not an Israelite by birth. She was a foreigner, and when she came to the kingdom, she began encouraging people to worship Baal. Of course, the situation reaches a point where Elijah ends up challenging the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and Elijah is a really brave guy. He goes, fire comes down, the sacrifice, he kills all the prophets of Baal, and he follows Ahab back to Samaria till he meets Jezebel. And then even he runs away. I don't think there really is a woman there named Jezebel, but there probably is a female prophet, and John is labeling her with that name because of the kind of things that she is encouraging. It's okay to participate in these activities. It's not a problem. You can do it. And what's more, in a place like Thyatira, You want to have a good business? Just go to the temple. Sardis. Sardis was also a very rich city. Remember the story of Midas' touch? Everything he touched turned to gold? That story comes from here. The Sardis River is where King Midas has to go and wash in order to relieve himself of the curse. They also attempted to build a temple to the emperor in 27. Interestingly enough, there is no mention here of any opponents like we've seen elsewhere. John says to this church here, he says to them, remember what you received and heard, obey it and repent. If you do not wake up, I'm going to come to you like a thief. You will not know what hour I will come to him. This is Jesus talking to the church, folks. Yet you still have a few persons in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. That statement, you have some people who have not soiled their clothes, indicates to us that out of all the Christians in Sardis, there seem to be some who have not acclimated themselves to the world around them. They are still perhaps not participating in the temple worship. They're not finding ways to prosper economically and socially if it means having to buy into what Rome says and to worshiping those pagans, gods. If you visit Sardis today, there is a synagogue there, Jewish synagogue. And off to the right, not in my picture tonight, is a very unusual thing, at least in its relationship to a synagogue. There is a gymnasium. And that gymnasium actually has an adjoining wall to the synagogue. That's very unusual in antiquity because Jews did not participate in the gymnasium. First of all, they saw it as a place where pagan practices happen. Second of all, gymnasiums were some place where you exercised naked. The Greek word for gymnasium comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. That's 2 Greek words you've learned tonight. We're going to collect double from you. Okay? Don't teach that to your kids. They'll only take it to school, okay? In addition to the gymnasium, though, is something very strange about this altar table in the middle of the synagogue. On the side of the table is this, the Roman eagle. The Jewish community in Sardis had become so acclimated to the area in which they lived and the benefits that they received from the system that they were very happy to put a symbol of the Roman Empire in their synagogue. If the Jewish population was willing to do this, it's not hard for us to imagine that Christians did it as well. Philadelphia. Located in a commercial area like Smyrna, there's no criticism. There's also a mention of a synagogue of Satan, so they seem to also be having opposition from the local Jewish population. Jesus' encouragement to them, be overcomers, be conquerors, which in the book of Revelation generally means embrace death, folks. The last church, and probably one of the most famous from the book of Revelation, the church at Laodicea. This church receives no praise from Jesus through the pen of John. Nothing. It is a very wealthy city. So wealthy that in 60 AD, when a devastating earthquake destroys everything in its area, including the city of Colossae, one of the cities to which the Apostle Paul wrote to, Colossae was never rebuilt. It was so devastating. Laodicea was not only able to rebuild, but they did it without any imperial help. Very wealthy. What's more, they went on to become a major center of banking, and which is why when Jesus writes to them through the pen of John, he says, you say, we're rich, we're in need of nothing. And Jesus responds and says, no, what you don't realize is that you are poor, pitiful, naked, and wretched. These are the words to Jesus. And what is probably the most ironic statement to any of the 7 churches, Jesus says to them, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anybody hears my voice and opens the door and lets me in, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. Jesus is outside of the church in Laodicea, knocking on the door, asking to be let in. If ever there was an unfortunate picture of the church. It's this. That's a verse and a rather iconic picture that we use for personal evangelism, but in its context, it's written to people in the church who should know better. If you visit Laodicea today, you will see numerous temples that archaeologists are uncovering and reconstructing. You will also see a lot more churches. In fact, there are dozens of churches in Laodicea, which makes you think that these people were really trying to make up for the lousy reputation they got in the book of Revelation. Laodicea went on to become a prominent Christian city for years to come. So where does that leave us with the churches? Well, we can make two conclusions from two perspectives. First, externally, they have pressures from the surrounding culture to accommodate the pagan practices. Some of them are actually receiving opposition from the local Jewish congregations, their cousins in the faith, if you will. You've got the ongoing pressure just in general to worship the emperor, and of course the lure of the Roman story. If you want to be successful, just follow the story. Internally, they're trying to contend with false prophets, teachers, and a prophetess who says it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. They're being pressured within by people like the Nicolaitans who are telling them that it's okay to be at peace with the surrounding culture and worship idols. And John's message to them doesn't distinguish between religion, politics, and economics. Because in the ancient world, they were all mixed together. And John is letting them know that if you're going to be involved with one, if you're going to commit to one, it's going to make you compromise in the other. If you think you're going to be successful in the Roman system, it's going to cost you as a believer. And that's the situation we find with the 7 churches. With that in mind, then, let's now take a look at what John is uncovering to these people with all of the images and stuff that you hear, which I know is what you really came to hear anyway. The easiest way I can think to present to you what John is trying to uncover for his audience tonight is to describe exactly what John does, and that is he presents 2 diametrically opposed options to these people. And he does it by describing them in the guise of creatures. On the one hand, there is the lamb. On the other, there is the beast. Immediately after his letters to the 7 churches, John then describes a heavenly vision. It is a vision of worship, of unparalleled size and content, where everybody who is alive and in heaven, all creatures, are worshiping God day and night. And John does this in a rhetorical streak of genius, because what he does is he doesn't want to talk about what's going on around them. He wants to immediately direct their attention to where it really should be, to where God is, to where true worship should happen. And in the middle of this, in chapter 5, then, we see John introducing to us the first creature, the Lamb, slain before the foundations of the world. And this Lamb is brought out, and He is the one who's only found throughout all of creation to be worthy to open up the seals on this scroll. And so the Lamb begins to open these seals, and for the next several chapters, what you read is what the Lamb is going to do to those who refuse to acknowledge His authority and to give proper worship to God and the Lamb. It is the Lamb making war on those who are making war against the Lamb. When you get to chapters 12 and 13, John then introduces the second beast. This beast, having multiple heads and horns, rising out of the sea. John brings it up here. And if you study what John has to say about the beast and you study what he has to say about the Lamb, what you begin to realize is that John is making a deliberate parody of the Lamb with the beast. Look at this chart. Both have horns and diadems. The Lamb is represented as the lion of the tribe of Judah. The beast has the face of a lion. The lamb gets his power from God. The beast gets his power from the dragon, which, of course, in the book of Revelation is Satan. The lamb is worshipped alongside God, whereas the beast is worshipped alongside the dragon. Both have power and authority over the tribes and the nation. The lamb is slaughtered. The beast is mortally wounded. The lamb has two prophets or witnesses. The beast has a false prophet. The lamb seals or marks his followers, and the beast marks his followers. The beast stands as a direct parody to everything that the lamb represents in the book of Revelation. And with this, John is trying to communicate to his audience a message about what they need to be careful of. And ultimately, he invites us in to figure out who the beast is. And he does it in chapter 13, verse 18, where John says to his readers, he says this, "This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. It is the number 666. John invites his readers to do the math. He wants them to figure out who this person is. It's an invitation. Incidentally, it's not 666, it's 666. Now, over the years, throughout history, there have been various attempts to identify the beast. Some have suggested that it's the Pope. Not John Paul II in particular. I tried to find a picture of a Pope without his face. This is the best I could do. But just the idea of the papacy in general and anybody who holds that office. We got time for a quick side story. In the 1990s, Lori and I lived in Virginia, and as we were driving home one day, I saw a billboard, black, with flames and beady eyes looking through. And it said at the bottom, "If you want to know the identity of the beast, call this number." Well, how can you resist that? And being a seminary student at the time, I went home and promptly called the number, received an answering machine, at which point they said, "Please leave your name and address and we will send you the identity of the beast." Oh boy. So I did that, and a few weeks later in the mail comes an envelope with a book, and I open it up, and they said to me that it was the beast, that the Pope was the beast. Okay. I picked up the phone, called the number back. This time when the answering machine came on, rather than telling them my name and address, I said, "So you think you know who I am? Well, I will never reveal my identity to you." I wished I'd have been in the office that morning. Some in the 19th century thought it was Napoleon. I mean, as he's conquering across Europe, you could perhaps understand why. In the 20th century, I think for obvious reasons, people thought that it was Adolf Hitler. In the 1980s, it may come as a surprise to you, but there were people out there who actually thought that the beast was Ronald Reagan. I remember listening to a radio program late one evening in which the guest said that if you take Ronald Reagan's full name, Ronald Wilson Reagan, for which there are 6 letters in each name, you get 666. For those of you who think the Gipper couldn't possibly be the beast, there was, of course, the old standby, Mikhail Gorbachev, with the unfortunate birthmark that people thought was the mark of the beast. Of course, there have been others over time. But John has somebody closer in time than somebody that far away. And I would submit to you tonight that John thinks, in fact, John is convinced that the beast is the person Nero. If you take Nero's name and you write it in Hebrew, like the monster can, and then you add up the name according to its numerical value, the number is 666, folks. John is inviting his audience without naming Nero by name, he's inviting them in. This is a common Jewish interpretive method known as gematria. They are playing with numbers. They do this many, many times in antiquity. We're familiar with this. When you then understand about the beast who was wounded and healed, and everybody is amazed in 13 verse 3, this sounds like a direct allusion to the rumors that Nero was going to come back someday. Oh, that's how you're pulling this all together. Okay. The statement that you can't buy or sell without the mark of the beast. Think about this. The only two things you can't do are buy and sell. You can't participate economically. If you don't buy into the system of Rome, if you don't buy the official line, you don't worship the emperor, you're not going to be successful. Now, when John reaches for the rumors about Nero, I don't think that he really imagines the Nero is going to come back. But John, though, is reminding the people in his audience of what has happened before. That Nero did make war on the saints in 64 AD. And John is reminding them that if they're not careful, if they're not watchful, that at any time the Roman system and any of its emperors can and will turn against them. The illusion of peace and security that people living in those 7 cities thought that they could get away with, John is saying, is not real. And in chapter 17, John demonstrates to them exactly the problem at the heart of the situation. He refers to Rome as Babylon, the whore. He does this for 2 reasons. First of all, again, reaching back to the Old Testament and bringing forth a story of another empire that not only conquered Jerusalem and destroyed their temple, but also led the people off into exile. This is a common way of referring to Rome in Jewish literature at this time. And then when he calls Rome a whore, this is a direct swipe at the goddess Roma. Roma sits on a beast with 7 heads, which John says are 7 hills. Rome was built on 7 hills. And what John is doing then is he says, Babylon is drunk with the blood of the saints. Open your eyes. This is for John a Wizard of Oz moment, folks. He is pulling back the curtain and he's saying, the person you think behind the curtain is not who you thought. When he gets then to chapter 18, he talks about what will happen when Rome is destroyed. He has the lament of Babylon. Again, look in chapter 18 who it is that is lamenting. It is the kings, the traders, the merchants. These are the only people John mentions. The very people who are going to actually benefit from the Roman system and everything it has to offer. And in the midst of this, John says, come out of her, lest you be caught up in her judgment. Rounding it off, John then moves into chapters 19, 20, and 21. This whole scene then the whole book begins to close the way John opened it. Again, with worship in heaven. John, again, redirects their attention to where it should be, where true worship is. And we are introduced then to Jesus as a conquering king. Jesus is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Jesus, not the emperor, John is saying, is the king. The appearance then of a new Jerusalem in chapter 21, the very city the Romans destroyed, comes down, and it stands in contrast to Rome and everything that the Romans stand for. In conclusion then, what then is the message of Revelation? John uncovers the truth about the Roman Empire and its emperors. What is he uncovering? He's uncovering the nakedness of Rome. And he's showing these people that the empire is actually a false kingdom led by false kings that actually is backed by Satan. The kingdom of Rome represents everything that Jesus, the kingdom of God, and the church is not. So the question then on all your minds tonight is, does John predict the end or not? And my answer to you is twofold. No and yes. No, if you think the book of Revelation is a roadmap to the end of the world that you can sit and watch the evening news and figure out exactly what's going to happen so that you can be ready. Yes, though, if you accept what John is promising, that one day God, through Jesus Christ, will be victorious over all evil and all people that are evil and stand in opposition to Him. That is the ultimate promise of the book of Revelation, folks. So what do we do with this rather odd document today? What can it mean for us living in the 21st century? The book of Revelation continues to warn us against being seduced by the wealth and the power and the false security that is all around us. The things that we think are going to give us security. As with the seven churches, John and Jesus call us to be radical followers and disciples of Jesus, even to the death, if necessary. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Byron. I have a couple of announcements, but just before that, we're going to make one more swipe for the sign-up cards. Angie in the back, there are a few people who came in late. You fill this out, pass it to my right, and she'll gather those and we'll pick those up in a second. Yeah, and we have some teachers who's willing to answer some questions, so two.
Two questions.
Rob?
Considering that the seven churches were all outside of Israel, and they were in a part of the world where Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, ministered. I'm assuming that a lot of the Christians there were not former Jews, but were Gentile converts. And if that's the case, John's use of Hebrew imagery, like the Jezebel, wouldn't have had as much traction with them.
Yeah, this is one of the mysteries that those of us that work in the field have to contend with, is how much did the people that were reading the document understand? But having said that, these are documents, the entire New Testament, in fact, are not meant to be read privately the way we do. They are to be read in public. They were, I would almost even say performed. And I'm assuming that whoever was doing that was well informed enough to explain anything that was not understood. I wouldn't, though, underestimate the learning curve that Christians go through, just as we do today, and that I think there's evidence from what we see here that there was at least Jews mixed in, or people that had been from Judaism in the churches. But you're right, they are, by this time, Christianity is becoming majority Gentile rather than Jewish at this time. Another question? Sorry, I'm seeing everybody pointing this way. Oh, sorry, there we go. We have 144,000. John actually seems to be using that number to talk about those who do remain faithful. He's using it to talk about both Israel and the church. I'm not talking about Israel as the nation, but he's using it to talk about we as believers are now part of Israel. I don't know if I'd go with the real 144,000. I mean, John is using 12, 12, 12 everywhere. He's trying to make a statement related to who Israel was. Yes, Tom?
Do you believe that the author was the same author as the book of John?
No. I think there's enough differences just language-wise and some other things. I would say the standard interpretation by many is that this is quite possibly somebody that we know from Ephesus known as John the Elder. There's more than one John in the ancient world. In fact, you should try having the name John in life, all right? That's another lecture. Irenaeus, early 2nd century father, identified this author to be John the Elder. It's only later that people start thinking that it's the Apostle John, who is also maybe related to the Gospel of John, or at least one of the disciples of him. So, Darius?
Do you think Paul would write Romans chapter 13 if he wouldn't see what John saw?
He wants to know, would Paul have written Romans 13, the government, obey the government? Yeah, at that time, it's interesting. When we talk about Nero tonight, when Paul wrote Romans, Nero was sort of like in his honeymoon period, and they thought it was an enlightened time. I don't think Paul voted for Nero, don't get me wrong. But I think he was at the point, he's like, time is short and be good citizens. And here's a guy who says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 10 and 11, he says, if you go to somebody's house and they're serving you meat, you're better off not asking them, right? Don't eat if you don't. John, by the time we get to about 30, 40 years later, has become even more radical because the problem has become even more severe and says, no way at all. And I think we recognize this happens in Christianity history. Situations develop and call for different approaches. All right, well, I'm going to hand it back over to Will. If anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, you are welcome. I see. Did you have a question, ma'am? Oh, your hand was like, okay. All right. Will, thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Byron.